The syringe trembled in Dr. Ernst Mueller's hand as he drew the cloudy amber liquid from the glass vial, the stench of rot mixing with antiseptic of the sweltering basement that served as his field hospital. Outside, artillery shook loose mortar dust from the ceiling. The boy on the table, 17 at most, his name lost in the chaos of evacuation, had maybe 4 hours before the gas gangrene spreading up his thigh reached his heart. Ernst had already amputated 3 men today. This one he would try to save differently. He pressed the needle into the boy's arm and depressed the plunger, injecting an extract he'd cultured from bread left to mold in a ceramic dish for 6 days. If he was wrong, he'd just killed a child with garbage. If he was right, he'd broken every principle of medicine he'd sworn to uphold. Wait, before the next revelation happens. If this story has already pulled you into the battlefield, tell us where you're watching from. To make sure you don't miss any forgotten acts of courage or impossible inventions, subscribe and join our front line of history. The mission's just getting started. Now, back to the scene. The boy's name was Jakob Hoffman and had stopped screaming an hour ago, which was worse. Ernst had learned in the first month of the war that silence meant surrender, that the body was making calculations beyond conscious will. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist, careful not to contaminate his hands, and checked the dressing on the wound. The tissue at the edges was black, the infection advancing with the methodical cruelty of trench warfare itself, millimeters per hour, taking ground that could never be reclaimed. How long has he been under? The voice belonged to Clara Steiner, the only nurse who hadn't been reassigned when the field hospital relocated to this commandeered schoolhouse 12 kilometers behind the front. She stood in the doorway, her apron stained with the day's catalog of injuries. 20 minutes since the injection. 4 hours since they brought him in. Ernst set down the syringe and reached for his pocket watch, noting the time in the leather journal he kept hidden in his medical bag. 1847 hours, 3rd September 1915. Patient 127. Compound fracture, right femur. Gas gangrene, advanced. Treatment, bread mold extract, 6 cc intramuscular. If there's no change in his fever by midnight, we prepare for amputation. Clara moved to the boy's side and placed her hand on his forehead. He's burning, 40 degrees at least. She met Ernst's eyes across the table. The mold, you're certain it's not just poisoning him faster? It was the question Ernst had been asking himself since he'd first noticed the phenomenon 3 weeks ago, when a corporal with a septic wound had recovered inexplicably after his bandages, stored in the damp cellar, had become contaminated with the same blue-green fungus. Ernst had initially dismissed it as coincidence, a natural recovery that would have happened regardless. But then a second case, a third. Men who should have died, who by every textbook and every professor's lecture should have succumbed to blood poisoning, walking out of his hospital with scars and stories. "I'm not certain of anything," Ernst said, "except that what we're doing isn't working. We've lost 43 men to infection in the past month alone. 43! More than we've lost to shrapnel or bullets." He gestured to the vial on the instrument tray, its contents catching the light from the kerosene lamp. If this kills him, it will be faster than the gangrene. If it saves him, we'll have saved someone who had no other chance. That's not medicine, that's gambling. Then we've been gambling since we started sawing off limbs and hoping the stumps don't fester. Ernst pulled up a stool and sat, the exhaustion of 48 hours without sleep settling into his bones. The war changed the rules, Clara. We adapt, or we watch them die according to the old ones. She said nothing, but she didn't leave either. Instead, she pulled up a second stool and took out her own notebook, the one where she tracked vital signs and fluid intake for every patient in their care. They fell into the familiar rhythm of a vigil, checking pulse and temperature every 15 minutes, documenting the incremental changes that could mean survival or collapse. At 19-20 hours, Jacob's fever spiked to 41 degrees. His breathing became labored, shallow. Ernst prepared the amputation kit, laying out the bone saw and clamps with mechanical precision, pushing down the voice in his head that whispered he'd murdered a boy with his arrogance. At 19-45 hours, the fever broke. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden gasp or flutter of eyelids. The thermometer simply read 40 degrees, then 39.5. Clara checked it twice, thinking she'd misread the mercury. Ernst pressed his fingers to Jacob's throat and felt the pulse, still rapid but stronger, more regular. He lifted the dressing. The black tissue at the wound's edge was still black, but it was no longer advancing. And at the very periphery, where infection met healthy flesh, the inflammation had reduced. Barely perceptible, perhaps imagined. Ernst pressed gently on the tissue, and Jakob flinched, pulling his leg away. An involuntary movement, but movement nonetheless. A response to pain. Life pushing back. "Mother of God," Clara whispered. Ernst said nothing. He was staring at the vial on the tray, at the cloudy liquid that looked like nothing so much as dirty water, and feeling the weight of what he'd just witnessed. If this was real, if the mold truly had some property that could fight infection, then he was holding something that could save thousands, tens of thousands. But he was also holding something he didn't understand, couldn't replicate with certainty, and couldn't explain to the medical establishment without sounding like a charlatan peddling folk remedies. "We need more," he said finally. "More mold, more extracts. Controlled doses, careful observation. We need to isolate what's actually working. Where are you going to get it? We barely have morphine. You think Command is going to authorize resources for moldy bread?" Ernst stood and walked to the small window that looked out onto the courtyard where ambulances came and went like clockwork. In the distance, the horizon flashed with artillery fire, a storm that never ended. Then we don't ask permission. We source our own materials, bread from the kitchen, ceramic dishes from the school supplies. We culture the mold in the cellar where it's dark and damp, and we extract it the same way I've been doing, filtering through cloth, diluting with saline. That's not a laboratory, that's a closet with jars. Pasteur cultured anthrax in his kitchen. Lister developed antisepsis in a ward that doubled as a stable. Ernst turned back to face her. "We're not trying to publish in a journal, Clara. We're trying to keep men alive until someone smarter than us figures out why this works." She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on Jakob's face. The boy's breathing had evened out, his features relaxed into something resembling sleep rather than unconsciousness. If this spreads, if other doctors hear you're injecting patients with fungus extract, they'll have you court-martialed for malpractice. Then we don't tell them. Ernst began cleaning the instruments, his movements methodical. We document everything in private. We only use it when conventional treatment has failed, when the alternative is amputation or death. And we find others who might be willing to help. Others like who? Like you. Clara met his eyes across the table. "I'm a nurse, not a researcher. You're someone who understands that the rules were written for a different war, a different world." Ernst set down the scalpel he'd been cleaning. "What I'm proposing, it's dangerous. To our careers, possibly to our lives if we're wrong. But Jakob is alive right now because we tried something impossible. How many more could we save if we tried harder?" The artillery barrage intensified, rattling the windows. Somewhere above them, men shouted orders. Somewhere beyond the walls, other boys Jacob's age were dying in ways that could be prevented if only someone was willing to break the rules that had proven inadequate. Clara closed her notebook and stood. "Show me how you prepare the extract, every step. If we're going to do this, we do it right." Ernst felt something uncoil in his chest. Not hope exactly, but its precursor, the possibility of hope. First, we need to move the cultures somewhere temperature-controlled. The cellar is too cold at night. It needs to be consistent. The coal room behind the kitchen stays warm. I can clear space. And we'll need a centrifuge, or something that approximates one. The extract needs to be as pure as possible. There's an old cream separator in the storage shed, used to be part of the school's dairy program. Ernst smiled despite himself. A cream separator. Pasteur would be proud. They worked through the night, converting stolen moments between patient emergencies into a shadow operation. By dawn, they had relocated 6 ceramic dishes of cultivated mold to the coal room, rigged the cream separator to function as a rudimentary centrifuge, and drafted a protocol for dosing and observation. Jacob's fever remained stable at 38 degrees. The gangrene had stopped advancing. By the end of the week, Ernst had treated 3 more cases with the extract. 2 showed improvement. 1 died, but not from the injection. A fragment of shrapnel had torn through his intestines before Ernst could even attempt treatment. The ratio was better than amputation, better than antiseptic alone. It was enough to continue. But it was also enough to attract attention. The problem came in the form of Oberarzt Heinrich Vogel, the senior medical officer for the division, who arrived unannounced on a Thursday morning in late September. He was a man built like a Prussian textbook, tall, rigid, with a mustache that seemed to have its own sense of military bearing. He found Ernst in the basement, filtering a fresh batch of extract through cheesecloth. "Dr. Mueller," Vogel's voice could have stripped paint. "I've received reports that you've been conducting unauthorized experiments on wounded soldiers. Specifically, that you've been injecting them with substances not approved by the medical corps." Ernst carefully set down the flask he was holding and straightened. "I've been treating infected wounds with a topical and intramuscular application that has shown promising results in reducing mortality from gas gangrene and sepsis." Promising results. Vogel descended the stairs, each footstep deliberate. "And what is the composition of this treatment?" "An extract derived from Penicillin mold, filtered and diluted in saline solution." The silence that followed was sharp enough. Vogel stared at Ernst as if he'd just confessed to witchcraft. "Mold?" "Yes, sir." "You're injecting wounded soldiers with mold? A sterile extract cultured from—" "I know what mold is, doctor." Vogel's face had gone red. "What I don't know is what possessed you to think you had the authority to experiment on men under your care with something that sounds like it came from a medieval plague ward." Ernst kept his voice level. "The men I've treated were facing amputation or death. Conventional treatments had failed. The extract offered a final option. An option you invented in a basement without oversight, without peer review, without any evidence beyond your own anecdotal observations?" Vogel picked up one of the ceramic dishes, studying the blue-green growth with obvious distaste. "How many have you treated with this?" 17 cases. 12 showed significant improvement. 3 stabilized. 2 died from unrelated complications. 12 out of 17? Vogel set down the dish. "And you think that constitutes success?" "Compared to amputation rates and sepsis mortality under current protocols, yes, I do." Vogel turned to face him fully. "You understand that what you're doing violates every standard of medical practice? That you're risking not just your career, but the lives of men who trusted you to provide legitimate care? I understand that I've kept men alive who would otherwise be dead. You've kept them alive with mold, Mueller. Mold that you grew in a school basement and filtered through kitchen cloth? If word of this reaches command, you'll be lucky to avoid a firing squad." Ernst felt his hands curl into fists at his sides. "Then I'll face the consequences. But I won't stop trying to save lives just because the method doesn't appear in a textbook." For a long moment, Vogel said nothing. He walked the length of the basement, examining the makeshift laboratory with the clinical detachment of a man evaluating evidence at a court-martial. Then he stopped, his back to Ernst, and spoke in a quieter voice. "My son is at the front, near Verdun." He was still facing away. "He's 19, enlisted against my wishes. Last letter I received, he mentioned a foot infection that wouldn't heal. Gas gangrene, most likely. They're preparing to amputate." Ernst's breath caught. Vogel turned. "If your mold extract can save lives, I need to know it's not just luck. I need evidence that what you're doing is medicine, not desperation masquerading as innovation." He gestured to the dishes, the equipment, the journal where Ernst documented every case. "You have 2 weeks to prepare a formal report. Document every case, every dosage, every outcome. I want survival rates, complication rates, comparison to standard treatments. If your data supports your claims, I'll present it to the medical command. If it doesn't, you'll surrender your medical license and face disciplinary action for unauthorized experimentation." 2 weeks, Ernst repeated. "And during that time, you continue treatments only on cases where conventional medicine has definitively failed. No experimentation on wounds that might heal with proper antiseptic care. Are we clear?" "Yes, sir." Vogel moved toward the stairs, then paused. "One more thing. This nurse you've been working with, Steiner, she's complicit in this as well." Ernst's jaw tightened. "She's been essential to maintaining documentation and patient care. If there's blame to be assigned, it's mine alone. I'm not assigning blame, doctor. I'm looking for allies." Vogel climbed the first step. "If your treatment works, we'll need people who understand how to produce and administer it. Train her properly, and pray your data is strong enough to convince men far more skeptical than I am." He left Ernst standing in the basement, surrounded by the quiet alchemy of mold and hope, with 2 weeks to prove that what he'd discovered in desperation could survive the scrutiny of science. The next 13 days blurred into a fever of documentation and refinement. Ernst and Clara converted the small storage room adjacent to the basement into what they optimistically called the research facility. In reality, a space barely large enough for 2 people, lined with shelves holding ceramic dishes of mold at various stages of cultivation. They established protocols for everything: sterilization procedures, extraction methods, dosing calculations based on wound severity and patient weight, observation schedules that tracked not just survival but recovery speed, complication rates, and long-term outcomes. The work was meticulous, exhausting, and constantly interrupted by the primary mission of keeping a field hospital operational in the midst of a war that seemed determined to produce new variations of human destruction. Ernst learned to function on 3 hours of sleep, stealing moments between surgeries to check on cultures or record data points. Clara became expert at what she called the art of invisible labor, the ability to perform critical research work while simultaneously maintaining the appearance of normal nursing duties, so that curious orderlies or visiting officers saw nothing unusual. They also began to expand the scope, cautiously. A sergeant with a septic leg wound that wasn't responding to antiseptic. A private whose jaw infection was threatening to spread to his brain. A corporal who developed blood poisoning from a bayonet wound. Each case was documented with photographic precision in Ernst's journal. Initial presentation, conventional treatments attempted, decision rationale for using the extract, dosage administered, hourly observations for the first 24 hours, then daily follow-ups. The results were maddeningly inconsistent. Some patients responded within hours, their fevers breaking and wounds beginning to heal with almost miraculous speed. Others showed no response at all, forcing Ernst to resort to amputation or watch them die despite his intervention. He began to suspect that not all molds were created equal, that the particular strain growing in their dishes might vary in potency depending on conditions he didn't yet understand. Temperature, humidity, the type of bread used as substrate, all of it seemed to matter, but he lacked the time and resources to isolate which variables were critical. On the 8th day, a pattern emerged. The patients who responded best to the treatment were those whose infections were caught relatively early, within 48 hours of onset. Once gangrene or sepsis had advanced beyond a certain threshold, the extract seemed to lose effectiveness, as if the infection had gained too much momentum to be stopped. This suggested a narrow window of opportunity, which in turn suggested the need for field hospitals to have ready access to the extract, to be able to administer it immediately, rather than waiting for conventional treatments to fail. The implications were staggering. If Ernst was right, they would need to produce the extract at scale, distribute it to every field hospital along the front, train doctors and nurses in its proper use. It would require an infrastructure that didn't exist, authorization from a military medical establishment that viewed innovation with deep suspicion, and resources that were already stretched impossibly thin. On the 10th day, Jakob Hoffmann walked out of the hospital on his own legs. His recovery had been slow but steady, the gangrene reversing its course, the tissue gradually healing from the inside out. He still had a limp, would probably always have a limp, but he was alive and whole when every conventional measure had said he should be dead or missing a limb. As Ernst watched him go, a boy in an ill-fitting uniform, shouldering his pack and heading back toward the nightmare he'd barely escaped, he felt the weight of what he was attempting settle more firmly on his shoulders. 1 life saved was a miracle. 1,000 lives saved was a responsibility he wasn't sure he could bear. On the 11th day, Clara fell ill. It started with a fever, then chills, then the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that signaled the body was fighting something serious. Ernst confined her to one of the hospital beds, ignoring her protests that she was needed in the ward. By evening, red streaks had appeared on her forearm, signs of blood poisoning spreading from a small cut she'd sustained while handling contaminated surgical instruments days earlier. Ernst stared at the wound, at the clear evidence of sepsis advancing along her lymphatic system, and felt something close to terror. She was the one person who knew the work as well as he did, who believed in it enough to risk her career. More than that, she'd become his anchor, the practical counterweight to his desperate theorizing. If she died because of an infection acquired while helping him, it would validate every criticism Vogel and others had leveled at his methods. He prepared a dose of the extract, his hands steadier than they had any right to be. "I need your consent," he said quietly, "for the record and for my conscience. Do you want me to try?" Clara, already pale and sweating, managed a weak smile. "If you let me die because you were too scared to use your own medicine, I'll haunt you from the grave. That's not consent, that's a threat." "It's both." She offered her arm. "Inject me, Ernst. Let's see if your mold works when it matters." He did, and then he sat beside her bed for the next 12 hours, monitoring her vital signs with the obsessive attention of a man who understood that this was no longer just about proving a theory or compiling data for Vogel's report. This was about whether he'd been right to trust his observations over established doctrine, whether the pattern he'd seen was real or the product of wishful thinking and confirmation bias. At hour 6, Clara's fever spiked to 41 degrees and she became delirious, calling out for someone named Otto, a brother, Ernst learned later, who died in the first year of the war. He bathed her forehead with cool cloths and whispered reassurances he didn't feel, watching the red streaks on her arm and wondering if they were advancing or if he was imagining their movement in the lamplight. At hour 9, the fever broke. The streaks were still there, still angry and red, but they'd stopped spreading. By hour 12, they'd begun to fade. Clara opened her eyes just after dawn, weak but lucid. "Did it work?" she rasped. Ernst was slumped in the chair beside her bed, the journal open in his lap where he'd been documenting every stage of her illness. "You're alive," he said, and heard the tremor in his own voice. "So, yes, it worked." "Good." She closed her eyes again. "Then stop looking like I died and finish your report. We have 3 days left." Those final 3 days were a blur of writing and rewriting, organizing data into tables and charts, double-checking every figure and observation against the original records. Ernst worked with the kind of focused intensity that comes from knowing that thousands of lives might depend on the clarity of his arguments, the strength of his evidence. He drafted an introduction that carefully avoided overstating his findings while making clear the potential significance. He included detailed case studies, Jacob, Clara, and 5 others whose recoveries had been particularly dramatic. He compiled survival statistics, comparing his patients to historical averages for similar wounds and infections. The final document was 27 pages, handwritten in the meticulous script Ernst usually reserved for patient charts. He titled it simply, Preliminary Observations on the Therapeutic Properties of Penicillium Extract in the Treatment of Bacterial Infections. He made 2 copies, one for Vogel and one for his own records, and sealed them both in wax to prevent tampering. On the 14th day, Oberarzt Vogel returned. He arrived in the late afternoon, his staff car pulling into the courtyard with the crisp efficiency of military precision. Ernst met him in the small office that served as the hospital's administrative center, the sealed report resting on the desk between them like evidence at a trial. Vogel broke the seal and began to read. Ernst stood by the window, watching the sun descend toward the horizon, listening to the rustle of pages turning. Minutes stretched into an hour. Outside, the evening casualty trains began arriving, their mournful whistles cutting through the twilight. Ernst counted them unconsciously. 3 trains, maybe 200 wounded, and wondered how many of them were already fighting infections that would kill them before their actual injuries could. Finally, Vogel set down the report. Your methodology is unconventional. Yes, sir. Your sample size is small. Yes, sir. Your conclusions are provocative and will be met with significant skepticism by the medical establishment. I expect nothing less, sir. Vogel stood and walked to the window, standing beside Ernst. For a moment, they both watched the wounded being unloaded from the trains, the orderlies moving with practiced efficiency, the whole grim machinery of wartime medicine in motion. My son had his leg amputated yesterday, Vogel said quietly. Above the knee. The infection had spread too far. He's alive, but hell will never walk properly again. Ernst said nothing. There was nothing to say. I wonder, Vogel continued, if your extract would have saved his leg. If I'd been faster in coming here, in taking your work seriously, whether he'd still be whole. He turned to face Ernst. But I wasn't faster. I did what I was trained to do. I was skeptical, thorough, careful. I followed the rules, and my son paid the price for my caution. Sir, I'm not blaming you, doctor. I'm explaining why I'm going to authorize continuation of your research, expansion of your facilities, and allocation of resources to scale up production of your extract. Vogel's voice was firm now, command returning. I'm also going to assign 2 additional doctors to work under your supervision, along with a dedicated supply officer and access to a proper laboratory space we're commandeering in the nearest town. You'll have 3 months to refine your methods and prepare a comprehensive training program for field hospitals across the division. Ernst felt the room tilt slightly. 3 months. After which, I'll present your findings to the Medical Corps leadership, along with documented results from expanded trials. If they approve, we'll begin large-scale implementation. Vogel picked up the report. And if they don't approve, we'll do it anyway and ask for forgiveness after we've saved enough lives to make court-martial politically inconvenient. For the first time in weeks, Ernst felt something like a smile touch his face. That's not very Prussian of you, sir. War has a way of making pragmatists of us all. Vogel moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. This report you've written, it's good science. Careful, methodical, honest about limitations. But it's missing something. Sir? A name. Your treatment needs a name. Something that captures what it is without sounding like folk medicine. Ernst thought for a moment, considering the blue-green mold that had become both his obsession and his hope, the Penicillium fungus that somehow possessed the ability to fight infection. Penicillin, he said finally. We'll call it penicillin. Vogel tested the word, rolling it around in his mouth. Penicillin. It sounds almost medicinal, almost respectable. He opened the door. Get to work, doctor. You have lives to save and skeptics to convince, not necessarily in that order. The laboratory space Vogel commandeered turned out to be the second floor of an abandoned textile factory in the town of Kreuzberg, 15 kilometers behind the lines. The building had been partially damaged by artillery fire months earlier, leaving the ground floor unusable, but the upper level relatively intact. It smelled of mildew and machine oil, and the windows were mostly broken, but it had three crucial advantages: space, isolation, and proximity to the rail line that supplied the field hospitals. Ernst arrived with Clara and two other doctors Vogel had assigned to the project. Dr. Anna Weber, a surgeon who'd worked in a Berlin hospital before the war and had a reputation for innovative wound care, and Dr. Friedrich Kessler, a pharmacist with experience in chemical extraction and purification. Together, they spent the first week clearing debris, patching the worst of the broken windows, and converting the factory floor into a functional research facility. They built incubation chambers from salvaged wood and canvas, maintaining the temperature and humidity levels they determined were optimal for mold cultivation. They requisitioned glassware from a university laboratory that had been emptied when its students went to war. They constructed a ventilation system using scavenged ductwork and a hand-cranked fan because the mold produced spores that could be dangerous in concentrated amounts. They even managed to acquire an actual centrifuge, though they had to trade 2 weeks of whiskey rations and a set of surgical instruments to get it. The work of scaling up production revealed complexities Ernst hadn't anticipated. The mold they'd been cultivating, the strain that seemed most effective, was finicky, requiring precise conditions to produce consistent yields. Too much moisture and it rotted. Too little and it dried out before reaching maturity. The extraction process was equally delicate. Too aggressive and they destroyed whatever compound was doing the actual work. Too gentle and the resulting solution was too diluted to be effective. Dr. Kessler became obsessed with purification. He ran endless experiments, testing different solvents and filtration methods, trying to isolate the active component from the crude extract. "We're injecting patients with what amounts to fungus soup," he complained one evening, staring at a beaker of the amber liquid. "There could be dozens of compounds in here. We need to identify which one is actually killing the bacteria." "We don't have time for that level of analysis," Anna countered. She was the practical voice among them, always focused on immediate implementation. The extract works, men are surviving. We refine as we go, but we can't wait for perfect understanding before we start saving lives. If we don't understand what we're doing, we can't predict side effects, drug interactions, proper dosing. We document everything and learn from the data. That's what field medicine is. Ernst listened to them debate, recognizing the tension between rigor and urgency that had defined his own thinking from the beginning. "Both of you are right," he said finally. "Friedrich, continue working on purification. If you can isolate the active compound, it will make production more reliable and dosing more precise. Anna, start training protocols with the field hospital staff. We need doctors and nurses who can recognize when to use penicillin and how to administer it safely." Over the next weeks, they developed a system. The factory floor became divided into zones: cultivation, extraction, quality control, storage. They trained a team of orderlies to maintain the incubation chambers, workers who'd been deemed unfit for combat but could follow precise instructions. They established a distribution network, using the military supply trains to deliver batches of penicillin to field hospitals along the front, accompanied by detailed instructions and documentation forms. The documentation was critical. Ernst insisted that every use of penicillin be recorded: patient information, wound type, dosage, outcome. The forms came back in bundles carried by the same trains that brought fresh supplies. Ernst and Clara spent their evenings reading through them, looking for patterns, trying to understand which cases responded best, which conditions predicted failure. The data was messy and incomplete. Field hospitals were chaotic environments, and careful record-keeping was often the first casualty of an overwhelming caseload. But gradually, a picture emerged. Penicillin worked best against certain types of bacteria. Streptococcus infections responded dramatically. Staphylococcus was more variable. Some strains seemed resistant, a discovery that worried Ernst deeply, but made a certain terrible sense. If bacteria could adapt to trench warfare, they could adapt to medicine. They also started seeing side effects they hadn't documented in the initial trials. Some patients developed rashes or fevers in response to the penicillin itself, allergic reactions that could range from mild to life-threatening. A few developed kidney complications when given too high a dose. One soldier died, not from his wounds, but from an anaphylactic reaction to the injection. His throat had swollen shut within minutes, faster than anyone could intervene. Ernst added that death to his private ledger, the accounting he kept of every consequence of his choices. He'd saved perhaps 200 lives by this point, maybe more. But he'd also killed one. The mathematics of war medicine offered no comfort. Every treatment was a calculated risk, every innovation built on a foundation of trial and error that used human beings as the experimental subjects. In late October, Oberarzt Vogel visited the laboratory unannounced, accompanied by two officers Ernst didn't recognize. One from the Medical Corps leadership, one from Army Command. They toured the facility in silence, observing the incubation chambers, the extraction process, and the quality control protocols. They examined the documentation, reading through case reports and statistical summaries. They spoke in low voices to each other, their faces carefully neutral. Finally, the Medical Corps officer, a colonel named Hartmann, turned to Ernst. "This is impressive work, Doctor. Unorthodox, but impressive. Your survival rates are significantly better than standard protocols for infected wounds." "Thank you, sir. However, there are concerns." The variability in your outcomes suggests we don't fully understand the mechanism of action. The side effects are non-trivial, and the production method you've developed, while ingenious, is hardly sustainable for Army-wide deployment. We'd need industrial-scale facilities, trained personnel, standardized procedures. Hartmann gestured to the factory floor. "What you've built here is a laboratory curiosity. We need a medical infrastructure." Ernst felt Clara's hand touch his elbow, a small gesture of support. "With respect, Colonel, what we've built here is a proof of concept. The infrastructure can be developed once the concept is accepted. Right now, men are dying of infections that penicillin can treat. Every day we delay implementation is a day we choose to let those men die. And every day we rush into implementation without proper controls is a day we risk killing men with a treatment we don't fully understand." Hartmann's voice was firm but not unkind. "I'm not dismissing your work, Doctor. I'm telling you it needs to mature before we can authorize widespread use." The officer from Army Command, a general whose uniform bore enough medals to outfit a battalion, cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, I believe we're approaching this from the wrong angle." He looked directly at Ernst. "Doctor, if you had unlimited resources, money, facilities, personnel, how long would it take you to prepare penicillin for full deployment?" Ernst thought carefully. "To refine the production process, establish industrial cultivation, develop quality standards, train sufficient staff, and create a distribution system. 6 months, maybe 8. And in that time, how many men would die from treatable infections? Tens of thousands, conservatively. The general nodded. Then here's what we're going to do. Dr. Mueller, you'll continue your work here with increased resources and oversight from Colonel Hartman's office. Simultaneously, we'll begin construction of a dedicated production facility near the rail depot in Mannheim designed to your specifications. You'll have access to chemists from the university, engineers from the pharmaceutical industry, whatever expertise you need. He paused. But in exchange, you'll submit to regular inspections, mandatory safety reviews, and a formal clinical trial process for new applications. We're going to do this right, doctor, which means both fast and careful. Can you work within those constraints? Ernst felt the room holding its breath. Anna and Friedrich were watching him, waiting. Clara's hand was still on his elbow. Outside the broken windows, the afternoon light was fading, and somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like thunder. "Yes, sir," Ernst said. "I can work within those constraints." "Good." The general turned to leave, then stopped. "One more thing. I want you to understand something about the decision we're making here. We're authorizing the use of an experimental treatment because the alternative, continuing with our current methods, is untenable. But that doesn't mean we're certain you're right. It means we're gambling that you are. If penicillin fails, if it causes more harm than good, the responsibility falls on all of us, but the weight of it will fall heaviest on you. Can you carry that?" Ernst thought of Jakob Hoffman walking out of the hospital, of Clara surviving blood poisoning, of the 200 names in his journal, patients who'd lived when they should have died. He thought also of the soldier who'd had the anaphylactic reaction, dying on a hospital floor while Ernst desperately tried to open an airway that had swollen shut. "I'm already carrying it, sir," he said quietly. The general held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. "I believe you are. God help us all." The next 4 months were a controlled avalanche of expansion and refinement. The facility at Mannheim became operational in early November, a purpose-built factory with real incubators, industrial centrifuges, and a staff of 25 people working in shifts to maintain production. Ernst split his time between the original laboratory at Kreuzberg, which they kept operational as a research facility, and Mannheim, where he supervised the scaling process and trained the new workers. The challenges of industrial production were different from laboratory work. In the controlled environment of the original lab, they could adjust conditions intuitively, tweaking humidity or temperature based on how the mold looked and smelled. In a factory setting, everything needed to be standardized, quantified, translated into procedures that could be followed by workers who had no scientific training. Friedrich Kessler took charge of this aspect, developing detailed protocols and checklists, creating a quality control system that tested each batch for potency and purity. Anna Weber focused on the clinical side, creating a training program for field hospital staff. She developed a curriculum that covered wound assessment, proper administration technique, recognition of allergic reactions, and documentation requirements. She even created a visual guide, a series of photographs and sketches showing the progression of different infection types and how they responded to penicillin treatment. By January, she'd trained medical staff at 30 different field hospitals, creating a network of doctors and nurses who understood both the potential and the limitations of the new treatment. The formal clinical trial that Colonel Hartman mandated began in December. It was a simple design. Field hospitals were randomly assigned to either continue standard treatment protocols or incorporate penicillin for cases of severe infection. The randomization was imperfect. Battle conditions didn't allow for rigorous experimental controls, but it was enough to generate data that could be analyzed statistically. Ernst hated the design because it meant deliberately withholding treatment from men who might benefit, but he understood the necessity. Medical science required evidence, and evidence required comparison. The preliminary results came back in February. At hospitals using penicillin, mortality from infected wounds dropped by 43%. Amputation rates decreased by 32%. Recovery times shortened by an average of 8 days. The numbers were clear enough that Colonel Hartman authorized immediate expansion of the program to all field hospitals in the division, with plans to extend to other divisions pending continued positive results. But the success brought its own complications. Demand for penicillin rapidly outstripped production capacity. Even with the Mannheim facility running at full capacity, they couldn't produce enough to treat every infected wound. Ernst found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to create triage guidelines, rules for which cases should receive penicillin and which should continue with conventional treatment. It was a physician's version of combat triage, choosing who lived and who died based on calculations of scarce resources. They prioritized based on severity and likelihood of benefit. Early-stage infections where conventional treatment still had a reasonable chance of success were deferred. Late-stage cases where infection had progressed too far were also deferred, though for different reasons. Penicillin rarely helped at that point, and the doses were wasted. The sweet spot was moderate to severe infections caught in the window where they were serious enough to be life-threatening, but not so advanced that tissue death was irreversible. It was a narrow window, but it was where penicillin made the biggest difference. The triage system was pragmatic but agonizing. Ernst received letters from field doctors begging for exceptions, describing patients who didn't fit the criteria but might benefit, asking why their wounded were deemed less worthy. He had no good answers. The truth that they simply couldn't produce enough penicillin for everyone who needed it offered no comfort to a doctor watching a patient die from an infection that might have been treatable. In March, a breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Dr. Kessler had been experimenting with different growth substrates, trying to find alternatives to bread that might produce higher yields. He'd been testing various materials, cornmeal, potato starch, malted barley, with mixed results. Then he tried a medium made from corn steep liquor, a byproduct of the corn processing industry that was normally discarded. The Penicillium mold grew in the corn steep liquor like nothing they'd seen before. The cultures were denser, more productive, and surprisingly more consistent in potency. A single batch using the new substrate could produce as much penicillin as 3 or 4 batches using bread. It was the kind of efficiency gain that changed the entire equation of production. "Where do we get corn steep liquor?" Ernst asked, staring at the thriving cultures. Kessler grinned. "That's the beautiful part. There's a corn processing plant 20 kilometers from here that's been dumping it into the river because they don't have storage capacity. I've already spoken to the plant manager. He'll sell us as much as we want for essentially nothing. He's thrilled to have found a use for waste he was paying to dispose of." Within 2 weeks, they'd converted the entire Mannheim facility to the new substrate. Production tripled. They began stockpiling reserves, building up supplies that could be distributed to hospitals preemptively rather than waiting for requests. The triage system remained in place, but the constraints eased. More men received treatment. More men survived. The data from the expanded clinical trial was unambiguous. By late March, the division's infection mortality had dropped by over half compared to the previous year. The results were published in the Military Medical Journal, accompanied by detailed protocols for penicillin use. Other divisions began requesting access to the treatment. The Medical Corps leadership, initially skeptical, became enthusiastic advocates. Plans were drawn up to construct additional production facilities to expand the program army-wide. Ernst should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt exhausted and oddly disconnected from the success. He'd achieved what he'd set out to do, proven that penicillin could save lives, built the infrastructure to produce and distribute it, trained enough people to implement it broadly. But the war was still grinding on, still producing an endless stream of wounded, still finding new ways to destroy human bodies. Penicillin had changed the equation, but it hadn't ended the calculation. On a Tuesday morning in early April, Ernst was at the Mannheim facility reviewing quality control reports when Clara found him. She was carrying a telegram, her face unreadable. "What is it?" Ernst asked. She handed him the telegram. It's from Oberarzt Vogel. Ernst read it quickly. The message was brief. Son developed post-surgical infection. Request penicillin treatment. Urgent. Ernst looked up at Clara. His son, the one who had the amputation, where is he? Hospital in Stuttgart, about 200 kilometers from here. Ernst checked his watch. It was 10 in the morning. Prepare a transport case with enough penicillin for a full course of treatment. Include dosing instructions and documentation forms. I'll take it myself. You'll take it? Clara looked surprised. Ernst, we have supply runners. You don't need to. His son might die because Vogel was careful when he should have been decisive. Because he followed the rules when he should have trusted his instincts. Ernst was already moving toward the storage area, calculating what he'd need. I owe him the courtesy of delivering this myself, and I need to see if it works. The train to Stuttgart took 6 hours, rattling through countryside that showed increasing signs of war, abandoned farms, damaged bridges, military encampments that stretched for kilometers. Ernst sat in the medical car, the transport case resting on his lap, thinking about the strange circularity of the moment. Vogel's son had suffered because Vogel had been slow to believe in penicillin. Now penicillin might save him, closing the loop in a way that felt almost too neat, too much like a story rather than the messy reality of war and medicine. The hospital in Stuttgart was larger than the field hospitals Ernst was used to, a converted school building that had been expanded with temporary structures to handle the overflow of casualties from the southern front. He found Vogel in a ward on the 2nd floor, sitting beside a bed where a young man lay burning with fever, his face flushed and his breathing shallow. Vogel stood when Ernst entered. "Dr. Mueller, you came yourself." "Of course." Ernst set down the transport case and moved to the bedside, assessing the patient with practiced efficiency. The stump where the amputation had been performed was inflamed, showing the clear signs of post-surgical infection. Not as advanced as some cases Ernst had treated, but serious enough to be life-threatening. "How long has he been like this?" 3 days. They've tried antiseptic treatment, but the infection is spreading. Ernst opened the case and began preparing a dose of penicillin. "I'll need to examine the wound directly, and I'll want to see his medical records, particularly the surgical notes." They worked through the afternoon, Ernst administering the first dose and then establishing a treatment protocol with the hospital's medical staff. He stayed through the night, monitoring the patient's vital signs, watching for the signs of improvement or deterioration that would tell him whether the penicillin was working. Vogel remained as well, keeping vigil beside his son's bed with the patient endurance of a father who'd already lost too much. The fever broke just before dawn. Ernst watched the thermometer drop from 40 degrees to 39, then to 38.5. The inflammation at the wound site began to recede. The young man's breathing eased, deepened, became the normal rhythm of natural sleep rather than the labored struggle of a body at war with itself. Vogel leaned forward, touching his son's forehead, feeling the change in temperature. "It's working," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's working," Ernst confirmed. "He'll need several more days of treatment, and the wound will need careful monitoring for signs of recurrence, but yes, I believe he'll recover." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sunrise through the ward windows. Finally, Vogel spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said when I first visited your laboratory, about the war changing the rules, forcing us to adapt or watch them die." "Sir?" "I've spent my career following rules, trusting established procedures, deferring to authority, believing that the system exists because it represents accumulated wisdom." Vogel gestured to his son. "But the system said he'd live the rest of his life diminished by war. You said he didn't have to. You were willing to break the rules to prove it." "The system wasn't wrong to be skeptical," Ernst said. "We still don't fully understand how penicillin works. We're still learning its limitations, documenting its side effects. The caution that frustrated me, it was medically sound. Perhaps, but caution that prevents action in the face of evidence is cowardice disguised as prudence." Vogel stood and moved to the window, looking out at the hospital grounds where orderlies were already beginning the day's work. "I've recommended you for a commendation, Dr. Mueller, for meritorious service to the medical corps. It will be formally presented when you return to Mannheim." Ernst felt uncomfortable with the idea of recognition. The work was collaborative. Clara Steiner, Friedrich Kessler, Anna Weber, they contributed as much as I did. Then I've recommended them as well. Vogel turned from the window. "But don't diminish your own role. You saw something others missed. You had the courage to pursue it despite institutional resistance. You built something that will save thousands of lives, perhaps millions in the years to come. That deserves recognition. Or blame if we're wrong about the long-term consequences." "Yes," Vogel agreed, "or blame. That's the burden of innovation. The responsibility extends in both directions." Ernst thought about the ledger he kept, the private accounting of lives saved and lives lost. "I can carry it," he said finally, "as long as the balance stays positive." He stayed in Stuttgart for another 2 days, monitoring Vogel's son and training the hospital staff on proper penicillin administration. The young man recovered steadily, his infection clearing, his strength returning. By the time Ernst left, he was sitting up in bed, eating solid food, complaining about boredom. All signs of recovery that filled Ernst with a satisfaction that was becoming familiar. The quiet triumph of a patient who'd walked the edge and stepped back. The train journey back to Mannheim was different from the journey there. Ernst felt lighter, despite his exhaustion. He'd saved Vogel's son. He'd closed the circle. And, more broadly, he'd proven that penicillin could work, even in difficult cases, even under pressure, even when the stakes were painfully personal. But he also carried a growing awareness that what he'd started, the transformation of a laboratory curiosity into a medical standard, was moving beyond his control. The war would end eventually. The immediate crisis that had justified cutting corners and accepting risks would fade. And then penicillin would be judged not by wartime pragmatics, but by peacetime standards. Would it survive that transition? Would the medical establishment that had resisted his work ultimately embrace it, or would they reject it as an aberration of desperate times? Ernst didn't know. He could only do what he'd been doing since the beginning: document everything, refine the methods, train others to carry on the work, and trust that the evidence would be compelling enough to overcome skepticism. The war ended on a Tuesday in November, not with dramatic finality, but with the slow deflation of exhausted armies. The armistice brought relief, but not celebration. Too much had been lost, too many had died for anyone to feel victorious. The field hospitals gradually emptied as wounded soldiers were transferred to permanent facilities or sent home. The urgent machinery of wartime medicine downshifted to the slower rhythms of peacetime care. Ernst remained at Mannheim, overseeing the transition of the penicillin production facility from military to civilian oversight. The medical corps wanted to maintain production. The treatment had proven too valuable to abandon. But control would gradually shift to civilian pharmaceutical companies and academic institutions. It was the right move, Ernst knew, but he felt a proprietary anxiety about letting go. This was his work, born from his observations and developed through his trials. Handing it over to others felt like entrusting a child to strangers. In December, he received an invitation to present his findings at the Berlin Medical Society, one of the most prestigious medical organizations in Germany. The invitation was formal, cordial, and clearly an assessment. The medical establishment was going to judge whether penicillin deserved a place in standard medicine or whether it should be relegated to a footnote in the history of wartime innovation. Ernst spent weeks preparing his presentation, refining his arguments, organizing his data into the most compelling narrative he could construct. Clara helped him create visual aids, charts showing survival rates, photographs documenting wound healing, statistical analyses comparing outcomes. Anna and Friedrich reviewed his drafts, challenging weak points, suggesting stronger framings. The presentation was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in January 1919 in the Grand Lecture Hall of the Society's headquarters. Ernst arrived early, his portfolio of materials tucked under his arm, and found the hall already filling with doctors, researchers, academics, the gatekeepers of medical legitimacy. He recognized some faces from his university days, professors who'd taught him the very principles he'd violated in developing penicillin. The introduction was made by the Society's president, a surgeon named Professor Dietrich, who'd made his reputation in anatomy and had a well-known skepticism toward therapeutic innovations. Dr. Mueller brings us findings from the recent war, Dietrich announced, regarding an unconventional treatment for bacterial infections. We'll hear his presentation, after which there will be time for questions and discussion. Ernst took the podium and launched into his prepared remarks. He described the initial observations, the development of extraction methods, the clinical trials. He presented the data clearly and without exaggeration, letting the numbers speak for themselves. He acknowledged limitations and unknowns, areas where further research was needed. He made no grand claims about having discovered a miracle cure, instead framing penicillin as a powerful tool that worked within specific parameters and required proper understanding to use safely. The questions began immediately after he finished. They were sharp, probing, sometimes hostile. "You're asking us to inject patients with mold extract. How is this different from medieval folk remedies?" The difference is documentation and reproducibility. We've identified the specific fungus responsible for the therapeutic effect, developed standardized production methods, and demonstrated consistent results in controlled trials. Your sample sizes are relatively small. How can we be confident the effects you observed aren't simply statistical anomalies? The data spans multiple hospitals, different patient populations, varying wound types. The consistency of improved outcomes across these different contexts suggests a real therapeutic effect rather than chance. What about long-term consequences? We have no data on what happens to patients years after receiving this treatment. That's true. This is a limitation we acknowledge. However, we also had no long-term data on many surgical techniques when they were first introduced. We make decisions based on available evidence and adjust as new information emerges. The questioning continued for over an hour, each answer spawning new questions, each explanation requiring further elaboration. Ernst felt himself growing defensive, having to remind himself that skepticism wasn't hostility. It was the appropriate response of careful scientists confronted with claims that challenged conventional understanding. Finally, Professor Dietrich called for a pause. "I think we've heard enough for initial assessment. Dr. Mueller, if you'll step outside, the Society will deliberate and provide you with our evaluation." Ernst gathered his materials and left the hall, stepping into the corridor outside. He found a bench and sat, feeling the exhaustion of the presentation settling into his bones. Clara had waited for him, and she appeared now from wherever she'd been watching. "How do you think it went?" she asked. "I think they're trying to decide whether I'm a visionary or a charlatan." Ernst managed a tired smile. "Possibly both." They waited for 30 minutes before the doors opened and Professor Dietrich emerged. His expression was neutral, revealing nothing. "Dr. Mueller, the Society has reached a preliminary assessment." Ernst stood, bracing himself for either validation or condemnation. "Your work is provocative and raises significant questions about our current understanding of bacterial infections and their treatment. The evidence you've presented is compelling, though incomplete. The Society believes that penicillin warrants serious further investigation." Dietrich paused. "We're offering you a research appointment at the university medical faculty, with funding to continue development of penicillin under proper academic oversight. You'll have access to laboratory facilities, trained personnel, and the resources needed to answer the many questions your presentation has raised." Ernst felt something unclench in his chest. The society is supporting further research? With conditions. You'll be expected to conduct rigorous clinical trials with larger sample sizes and longer follow-up periods. You'll need to work on isolating and characterizing the active compound in your mold extract. You'll be subject to peer review and regular reporting on your progress. Dietrich extended his hand. But yes, Dr. Mueller, the society is supporting your work. You've done something remarkable. Now you need to understand it well enough to make it reproducible and teachable. Can you do that? Ernst shook his hand. Yes, sir, I can do that. The research appointment became the foundation for the next decade of Ernst's life. He established a laboratory at the university, hired assistants, developed collaborations with chemists and microbiologists. The work of understanding penicillin, truly understanding it at a molecular level, was slower and more meticulous than the desperate improvisations of wartime. But it was also deeper, more satisfying in its way. Each discovery built on the last. Each experiment refined their knowledge. Each publication contributed to a growing body of evidence. Friedrich Kessler eventually succeeded in isolating the active compound, identifying the specific molecular structure responsible for penicillin's antibacterial properties. Anna Weber developed comprehensive training programs for medical schools, teaching a new generation of doctors how to use antibiotics effectively. Clara became the laboratory manager, overseeing the day-to-day operations with the same practical competence she'd brought to the field hospital. Production expanded beyond Mannheim to facilities across Germany and eventually Europe. Pharmaceutical companies took interest, investing in large-scale manufacturing. By the mid-1920s, penicillin was becoming standard treatment for bacterial infections, its use governed by protocols and guidelines that had evolved from Ernst's original observations. The success brought recognition. Ernst received awards, honorary degrees, invitations to lecture internationally. He was featured in medical journals and popular magazines, held up as an example of how innovation could emerge from unexpected places. The attention made him uncomfortable. He'd never sought fame, only to save lives. But he accepted it as part of the responsibility he'd taken on. But he also never forgot the ledger, the accounting of consequences. For every patient penicillin saved, there were others it couldn't help. For every success story, there were complications, side effects, allergic reactions. The soldier who died from anaphylaxis remained in Ernst's memory, a permanent reminder that even miracle cures had limits and costs. In 1928, a British scientist named Alexander Fleming published a paper describing his observations of Penicillium mold inhibiting bacterial growth. The work was independent of Ernst's research, arrived at through different circumstances, but the conclusions were similar. Ernst read Fleming's paper with a mixture of validation and irony. The phenomenon he'd discovered in a German field hospital basement was now being documented in a London laboratory, with the full weight of academic rigor and British institutional support. Fleming's work brought renewed attention to penicillin, particularly in English-speaking countries where Ernst's German publications had received limited circulation. There were debates about priority, about who should receive credit for the discovery. Ernst found these discussions tiresome. The important thing wasn't who discovered penicillin first, but that it had been discovered at all, developed into a practical treatment, and made available to patients who needed it. By the time World War II began in 1939, penicillin was well established in European medicine. When the war reached full intensity, the treatment that had been developed in one war proved essential in another. Allied forces, building on Ernst's work and Fleming's research, produced penicillin on industrial scales, saving countless lives and changing the trajectory of military medicine. Ernst, now in his 50s, watched this second war from a distance, grateful that his discovery could serve a new generation of wounded soldiers, troubled by the fact that there was a new generation of wounded soldiers at all.